In this video, I'm going to show you how I, as an educator, use open questions to challenge discriminatory views that are shared in my classrooms or workshops. I call these questions critical questions, and basically they encourage students to think critically about their own ideas without telling them that their idea is wrong or what they should think in its place. So in this video, I'll walk you through how I come up with these critical questions on the spot, because truthfully, that's the hardest part for me. Wrapping my head around, okay, what is the best question I can ask to challenge this idea? Especially when I'm thinking like, what did this person just say? Holy I'll also share a couple real life examples of how I would use this strategy so that it's really actionable for you and you know exactly how to use the strategy by the end of this video. But first, hi friends. If you're new here, my name is Maureen. I've been a facilitator for over a decade, and I work with young adults and adults from all over the world to have meaningful conversations about sensitive, often controversial topics through a social justice lens. Before we dive into the video, I want to let you know that I've created a brand new comprehensive guide on 4 essential strategies to navigate conflict in the classroom. This guide is totally free. You can just visit the link down below. This strategy that I'll be talking about today is one of the 4 strategies. And if you're interested in other questioning techniques and facilitation methods for managing conflict, I highly recommend downloading the full guide. All right, now let's get into the video. Okay, so first off, let's think about how a critical question is different from any old open question. So while a critical question is still technically an open question, it's much more directive. So let me give you an example. If someone proposes a harmful view in the classroom, a totally open question would be, what makes you think that? Okay, or why do you think that? A critical question might sound like, why might that view be dangerous, right? So I'm actually orienting the line of questioning in a very particular direction. I am asking the student or the students to think about the view from an angle that I think would be useful to explore to challenge the view. For a long time in my facilitation, I really struggled with critical questioning. It was definitely one of the areas that I was most insecure in. And I had a long list of good critical questions that I would try to study and memorize so that they would come to me more easily in the moment. But you know, when someone says something that really throws you off, it's challenging to come up with a good question that you feel like is appropriate to the moment. My mind would just go blank with all of the different options I had. And it wasn't until I really broke it down and had this sort of like epiphany around critical questions that it became a lot easier for me. All right, so listen up. When someone shares a harmful view, there are really 2 core ways to challenge the view. Either by asking them where that idea came from, or by asking them what the idea does. And I call those 2 different lines of inquiry either an origin focus or an impact focus. And knowing that those are my 2 different options, either I can question where the idea came from or what the idea does, really helps me come up with a powerful question on the spot every time. And I'm going to give you 2 different real life examples of harmful comments that have been offered in my classrooms or workshops. And together we're going to apply this framework to respond to the harmful comment. Just know that there is no correct order to apply this framework. It's not like you have to start with an origin focus and end with an impact focus. Okay, you can start with either set of questions and you can mix and match them together. This first example I'm going to walk you through, I did not respond in the way that I wish I would have responded. So I was teaching a high school advisory class at the time. And for context, this is at an international school in France where I'm currently based. And we were exploring homophobia in the workplace and in schools. And one of the stats that I pulled up said that only 38% of employees are out at work. And at that point, a French student raised their hand and said that actually they didn't see a problem with this statistic at all, and that they thought that that people had no business in talking about their sexual orientation at work, that in France especially, we just had a culture where that was inappropriate to talk about in the workplace, and that was really not oppressive to anybody in particular. So after the student shared, I remember really tensing up and going into a short, probably rambly lecturing moment. I stated a lot of different ways that this belief was harmful, and then I just moved on. In retrospect, what I really wish I had done is pause for a moment, rephrase the view, and then asked a critical question to the group. For example, I could have said, so Steve just offered a point of view that we hear a lot, this idea that people have no business disclosing their sexual orientation at work, and I want to pause here for a moment and just explore this view. And then I could decide to focus on the origin of the idea. So maybe I could ask, who's heard this idea before? Where have we heard this idea before? I wonder, who do you think decided that it's inappropriate to talk about your sexual orientation at work? Are all sexual orientations thought to be inappropriate in the same regard? And who might disagree with this idea? Or I could focus on the impact. So I could ask, who might be overlooked or harmed by this idea? And very concretely, what might a gay employee need to put in place in order to respect this norm? Of course, I would not ask all of these critical questions one after the other like that. I would ask one to begin the inquiry, and then I might ask one or two others over the course of the whole exploration, just to make sure that we tackled all the points that I thought were really important. But asking too many critical questions would be really exhausting to your group, and quite frankly, it's just not necessary. The second example happened just a couple weeks ago. So I had this critical question framework, and I think that it helped me respond in a way that is much better than the first example. So the context was that I was facilitating a workshop with adult learners on equity, inclusion, and belonging in education. I was in the middle of presenting a study on how structural racism and stereotype threat affected the well-being of students in high school when a parent raised their hand on Zoom, so I called on them. And they said in quite an emotional way that if we're going to talk about well-being in schools, then an issue that we need to urgently talk about is how affirmative action and other measures of this type are really impacting the ability of white kids to get into college, and how that is taking a toll on their mental health because they are no longer really assessed on their merit, but assessed on things like how diverse their sexual orientation and their racial identity is. And she said something along the lines of, nowadays, unless you're a racial, ethnic, or sexual minority, you basically have no chance of getting into an elite college. All right, so there is a lot to unpack in this comment. My number one suggestion is to actually not try to unpack everything as a facilitator and know that that's not possible and that's not really useful. That's also something I used to try to do, where now I'm just like, let me just unpack one thing of this word salad that the participant just handed to me. If I can critically question one of the points that this person just made and move the needle along, then it's a success. So in the moment, I decided, okay, I'm gonna focus on the premise of one of the things that she said. And I started off by saying, okay, thank you for sharing, Madeline. What do we actually know about affirmative action? Okay, is there anybody in the group that has knowledge around this area and that could tell us about the logic and the history behind affirmative action? And that actually worked out really well. One of the people luckily raised their hand right away and offered a very clear and concise definition of what affirmative action was and what it did and didn't do. And that spurred a really good conversation where a couple of other people pitched in. And I felt like the explanation that was given by the participants was far superior to anything that I could have offered. And it had much more impact because it came from the group. And so that conversation went on for, I don't know, like a good 4 or 5 minutes. And all that I was doing as the facilitator is I was sitting back, I was calling on different participants that were raising their hand and connecting the comments that they were making, summarizing some of the key points. And once I felt like what needed to be said was said, I asked one last critical question to invite reflection from an angle that we had not explored yet, which was when we say that a student who's part of a sexual or racial minority group got into college just because of their identity, what are we implying about them? I want us to really think about that. Let's name what are some of the things that we're implying about that student and what are the potential effects of that belief system. So that was a conversation that I thought was really productive, and it involved so many different participants in the group, which was way more effective than if I had just answered the participant and then moved on. And I got the sense, at least I hope, that the person who offered the initial idea didn't feel a ton of shame or personal aggression. It was just very clear that we were all getting curious about this idea and exploring the origins and the potential impacts, rather than just responding to her as a horrible, racist, sexist, homophobic person or something like that, which she's probably not, okay? It was just a very emotionally charged, pretty ignorant view that I've had a lot of those in the past, and I think that facilitation, it's so important to hold that as a facilitator. It's I was there. I could have. I'm not a mother with a daughter trying to get into college, but I could have held that view at some point in time. So how do I, as the facilitator, act like the bigger person and put this comment really in service of the learning, of the group learning, rather than making it personal to this participant? I'm convinced that had I not had this critical question framework, I would not have thought to ask the questions in the way that I did. It might take a little while for this framework to really become second nature, but I tell you, it has transformed my ability to deal with difficult moments. And if you download the guide that I put together and the workbook also that helps you come up with some of these questions that are your go-to ways of challenging harmful views, it's just made me so much more confident. And I just am convinced it's a really useful tool. So I hope that you will go forth and use it in your context. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it was helpful. I would love to hear your thoughts down below, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.